How do you face the man who shattered your world? Alina Vesper's ex-husband, Adrian Vale, cast her aside for a glamorous model, believing he'd left her broken and forgotten. He's about to make his grand entrance at the social event of the season, ready to flaunt his perfect new life. But he's forgotten one small detail: Alina. And she's not just coming back. She's arriving pregnant with his secret child, and on the arm of a reclusive billionaire who holds Adrian's future in the palm of his hand. This isn't just revenge, it's a reckoning. Before we begin, take a moment and comment your city below. It's always fascinating to see where everyone is tuning in from around the world. Now, let's dive in. The reflection staring back at Alina Vesper from the rain-streaked window of her small apartment wasn't the woman she recognized, but a ghost. A ghost of a life she once lived, a life of sun-drenched afternoons on the Amalfi Coast, and the hollow clink of champagne glasses at galas that blurred into one another. That woman had been Mrs. Adrian Vale, a title that had felt both like a shield and a cage. Now, she was just Alina. And Alina was tired. Her bones ached with a weariness that had nothing to do with the pregnancy she was hiding from the world, and everything to do with the man who had put it there. 6 months. It had been 6 months since the divorce was finalized, a clean, surgical cut that had severed their 7-year marriage with the cold precision of Adrian's ambition. He had called it conscious uncoupling, a term he'd picked up from a lifestyle blog, as if their shared history was a trendy piece of furniture they had mutually decided to discard. But there was nothing conscious about the way he had systematically dismantled her, piece by piece, until she was a stranger in her own skin. He had told her she was too emotional, too needy, that her quiet nature didn't fit the dynamic image he needed to project as one of New York's most aggressive real estate developers. He needed a powerhouse, he'd said, a statement piece. He had found one in Vivienne Murray, a model whose face was currently plastered on a billboard in Times Square, selling perfume with a smoldering gaze that promised a world of excitement Alina had never been able to offer. It was through Instagram, the modern-day town square for public humiliation, that Alina had learned of their engagement. A picture of Vivian's hand, slender and manicured, adorned with a diamond so large it looked obscene, her ring finger intertwined with Adrian's. The caption read, "A new chapter with my king. I said yes." The post had been a dagger to the heart, not because she still loved Adrian. That love had died a slow, painful death long before the papers were signed, but because of the sheer, unadulterated cruelty of it. He hadn't even had the decency to tell her himself. He had simply moved on, erasing her as if she were a rough draft of a life he was now perfecting with a new, upgraded model. The comment section was a sea of fawning congratulations from his sycophantic circle, the same people who had once called Alina their friend. They gushed about how perfect Adrian and Vivienne were together, how they were a power couple, a term that made Alina's stomach churn. Her hand went instinctively to her belly, a gentle, protective gesture. The small, burgeoning curve was the only thing that was truly hers. A secret, a complication, a tiny fluttering heartbeat that was both a blessing and a terrifying burden. She had found out 2 weeks after Adrian had left, the irony so bitter it had made her laugh until she cried. He had always been ambivalent about children, claiming they were a distraction, a lifestyle anchor that would slow him down. He didn't want to be tied down, and now here she was, tied to him in the most irrevocable way possible, and he had no idea. Her apartment, a cozy 1-bedroom in a pre-war building in the West Village, was her sanctuary. It was a world away from the sterile, glass and chrome penthouse she had shared with Adrian, a place that had always felt more like a showroom than a home. Here, the walls were lined with books, the furniture was soft and worn, and the air smelled of old paper and the lemon tea she drank to soothe her morning sickness. It was small, but it was hers, paid for with the modest settlement Adrian's lawyers had deemed generous. It was just enough to keep her from being destitute, but not enough to maintain the life he had taught her to lead. It was, she knew, a calculated move. He wanted her gone, but not so far gone that she might become a problem. He wanted her to disappear quietly. Tonight was the annual Starlight Gala, a glittering charity event that was the crown jewel of the New York social season. She and Adrian had attended every year of their marriage. It was a night of performance, of networking disguised as philanthropy, a stage where Adrian shone his brightest. She knew he would be there with Vivian, parading her like a trophy. The thought of it sent a fresh wave of nausea through her. And this time, it had nothing to do with the baby. A notification lit up her phone screen. It was an email from the event organizers, a generic reminder about the gala. Her name was still on the list, a forgotten relic of her past life. She had been about to delete it when an idea, small and dangerous, began to take root in her mind. Why should she be the one to hide? Why should she be the one to shrink into the shadows while he celebrated his new life on the ashes of their old one? The power imbalance had always been the unspoken third party in their marriage. He was the sun, and she was expected to be a pale, reflecting moon. He had controlled the money, the friends, the narrative. He had convinced her that she was nothing without him, that her quiet strength was a weakness. But the past 6 months of solitude had taught her otherwise. She had started painting again, her canvases filling with the vibrant colors that had been muted for so long. She had reconnected with old friends, the ones who had known her before Adrian, the ones who saw her, not as an accessory, but as Alina. And then there was the baby. This tiny, secret life growing inside her had ignited a fierce, protective instinct she never knew she possessed. It wasn't just about her anymore. She had to be strong for them. She looked at her reflection again, but this time she saw something different. Not a ghost, but a woman on the edge of a transformation. The weariness was still there, but underneath it, a flicker of defiance. He wanted her to disappear? Fine. But first, she would make him see her. Really see her. Not as the timid wife he had discarded, but as the woman and the mother she was becoming. She opened her closet, pushing past the sensible, muted clothes she had adopted to please him. At the very back, wrapped in a garment bag, was a dress she had bought on a whim in Paris, a deep emerald green silk that shimmered like a jewel. Adrian had hated it. Too ostentatious, he had declared. It draws too much attention. A slow smile touched Alina's lips. Perfect, she whispered to the empty room. She would go to the gala. She wouldn't cause a scene. She wouldn't cry or scream. She would simply appear. A ghost from his past, walking into his perfect future. And she wouldn't be alone. She would have her secret, her strength, her emerald green dress. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel was a symphony of excess. Crystal chandeliers, each the size of a small car, dripped light onto a sea of tuxedos and designer gowns. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the low hum of self-congratulatory chatter. It was a place where fortunes were flaunted, alliances were forged, and reputations were made or broken over a glass of vintage champagne. For Adrian Vale, it was his natural habitat. He stood near the grand staircase, a king surveying his court. At his side, Vivian Mare was a vision in crimson, a stark, fiery contrast to the cool tones of the ballroom. The dress, a couture creation that clung to her statuesque frame like a second skin, was cut daringly low, showcasing the diamond necklace Adrian had gifted her that morning. It was a statement, just like Vivian herself. She was his ultimate acquisition, the living embodiment of his success. "Darling, you're staring," Vivian murmured, her voice a low, throaty purr. She ran a perfectly manicured finger down the lapel of his Tom Ford tuxedo. "Is someone more interesting than me in the room?" Adrian forced a smile, his eyes scanning the crowd. "Never, my love. Just ensuring everything is perfect." He was a man obsessed with perfection, with control. Every detail of his life was curated, from the art on his walls to the woman on his arm. Tonight was the culmination of a 6-month campaign to rebrand himself. The messy divorce from the mousy, unassuming Alina Vesper was a distant memory, a footnote in the story of his ascent. Vivian was the new, thrilling chapter. "Adrian, there you are," a voice boomed. It was Charles Thorne, a contemporary in the real estate world, a man whose respect Adrian craved. Charles was old money, but he admired Adrian's new money ruthlessness. "And the lovely Vivian. You two are the talk of the town. That ring," Vivian preened, extending her hand for Charles to admire. "Adrian has exquisite taste," she said, her eyes flicking to Adrian, a silent reminder of her value. "He certainly does," Charles agreed, his gaze lingering on Vivian a moment too long. "Big night for you, Adrian. I hear the final bids for the Hudson Yards project are due next week. Rumor is you're the front runner." "We're confident," Adrian said, his voice smooth as polished marble. It was the biggest deal of his career, a legacy-defining project that would cement his place at the top of the New York real estate food chain. Everything was riding on it. His public image, his relationship with Vivienne, his entire future. It was all tied to this deal. The conversation drifted to market trends and zoning laws, a language Adrian spoke with fluent, predatory grace. Vivienne, for her part, played the role of the adoring fiancée perfectly, nodding at the right moments, her smile never faltering. But beneath the surface, she was bored. This world of men talking about money was a means to an end. The end was the lifestyle, the security, the envy of other women. She had climbed her way out of a working-class neighborhood in Queens, using her face and her body as currency. Adrian Vale was her biggest score yet, and she had no intention of losing him. As Adrian held court, his mind drifted, unbidden, to Alina. He felt a pang of something he refused to name. Not guilt, but an annoying, lingering inconvenience. He had expected her to crawl into a hole and disappear. He had paid her off, washed his hands off her. And yet, he couldn't shake the feeling of a loose thread. Their last conversation had been sterile, conducted through lawyers. He had never had to face the raw, human cost of his decision. He had simply moved on. He remembered her in this ballroom 2 years ago. She had worn a simple navy dress, elegant but understated. She had spent most of the night by the dessert table, talking to one of the waiters about his family in Ecuador. She had a way of connecting with people, a genuine warmth that he had once found endearing and later suffocating. It was a quality that had no value in his world. It was a liability. "Is everything all right, Adrian?" Vivian asked, her voice sharp, cutting through his reverie. "You seem a million miles away." "Just thinking about the deal," he lied smoothly, taking a sip of his champagne. "The pressure is immense." "Well, you have me to help you relax later," she whispered, her hand sliding from his arm down to the small of his back, a possessive, promising gesture. It was then that a subtle shift occurred in the room's atmosphere. A ripple of whispers started near the entrance, spreading like a wave through the crowd. Heads turned, conversations paused. Adrian, his senses attuned to the social currents of the room, felt it instantly. A new player had entered the game. He followed the line of sight of the other guests, and his blood ran cold. Standing at the top of the grand staircase, bathed in the light of the chandeliers, was Alina Vesper. But it wasn't the Alina he remembered. The mousy, apologetic woman who seemed to shrink in on herself was gone. In her place stood a queen. The emerald green dress was a slash of vibrant, defiant color in the sea of muted tones. It clung to her curves, curves that were fuller, more womanly than he remembered. Her hair, which she used to pull back in a severe bun, cascaded over her shoulders in soft, honey-blonde waves. Her face, free of the heavy makeup he had always insisted she wear, was luminous, her eyes clear and bright. She looked powerful. For a heart-stopping moment, Adrian couldn't breathe. It was as if a ghost had walked into the room, but a ghost more vibrant and alive than anyone there. Vivian stiffened beside him, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his arm. "Who is that?" she hissed, her voice laced with venom. Adrian couldn't answer. He was transfixed. Alina's eyes swept across the room, a calm, unhurried survey. She wasn't looking for him. She didn't seem to be looking for anyone. She was simply arriving. And then he saw who was with her. Descending the stairs just behind her, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back, was Gabriel Ashford. Not Charles Thorne, the real estate contemporary, but his uncle. The Gabriel Ashford. The reclusive, enigmatic billionaire who had built an empire designing and selling private jets to the world's elite. A man so wealthy and powerful, he made Adrian look like a small-time landlord. Gabriel Ashford didn't attend social events. He didn't court the press. He was a legend, a myth, a man who operated in a stratosphere so far above Adrian's, it was barely conceivable. And he was with Alina. The sight was a physical blow. Adrian felt the air leave his lungs, the carefully constructed facade of his perfect life cracking under the weight of this single, impossible image. Alina, his discarded, forgotten ex-wife, was not just here. She was here with a man who could ruin him with a single phone call. The power imbalance, the one he had so carefully cultivated and exploited in his marriage, had just been flipped on its head in the most public and spectacular way imaginable. The whispers in the room grew louder, turning from curious to frenzied. Who was she? What was she doing with Gabriel Ashford? Adrian could feel hundreds of pairs of eyes on him, the collective gaze of the world he had worked so hard to conquer. They were all waiting to see what he would do, and for the first time in his life, Adrian Vale had no idea. The king was in his castle, but his fortress had just been breached, and the ghost of his past was about to hold him accountable. Alina's heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. Each step down the marble staircase felt both terrifyingly slow and dizzyingly fast. The sea of faces below blurred into a kaleidoscope of judgment and curiosity. She could feel their stares, their whispers dissecting her, trying to place her in their rigid social hierarchy. For a moment, the old Alina, the one who would have fled from this kind of attention, threatened to resurface. She faltered, her hand gripping the cold, ornate balustrade. "Easy now," a low, calm voice said from just behind her. "Just breathe. They're more scared of you than you are of them." She glanced over her shoulder at Gabriel Ashford. He wasn't looking at the crowd. He was looking at her, his eyes a surprising shade of warm grey, holding a steady, reassuring calm. They had met less than an hour ago, in the most unlikely of circumstances. She had arrived at the gala alone, her taxi dropping her a block away to avoid the crush of limousines. The cold night air had been a shock after the warmth of the cab, and as she'd stepped onto the curb, her heel had caught in a grate. She'd stumbled, a small, undignified lurch, and a portfolio of her recent sketches, which she'd brought with her for a bizarre sense of moral support, had slipped from her grasp, scattering across the damp pavement. Mortified, she had knelt to gather the loose pages, her hands trembling. That's when a large, masculine hand had appeared in her line of sight, carefully picking up a charcoal drawing of a wind-swept cypress tree. "This is very good," the same low voice had said. "You have a strong sense of movement." She had looked up into the face of Gabriel Ashford. She didn't recognize him at first. He wasn't what she expected. He was dressed in a simple, impeccably tailored black suit, no tie, the top button of his white shirt undone. He was older than her, perhaps in his late 40s, with a rugged, weathered handsomeness that stood in stark contrast to Adrian's polished, gym-honed perfection. There were lines around his eyes, lines that spoke of a life lived, not just curated. "Thank you," she had stammered, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "Allow me," he'd said, easily gathering the rest of the sketches. He didn't treat her like a damsel in distress, but like an equal who had met a minor inconvenience. He handed the portfolio back to her, his fingers brushing hers. There was a jolt of warmth, of unexpected connection. "I'm Gabriel," he said, his smile not reaching his eyes, which held a deep, almost melancholic intelligence. "Alina," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. He had looked at her then, a long, searching look. It wasn't the predatory gaze she was used to from men in Adrian's circle. It was knowing, as if he could see past the emerald dress and the nervous tremor in her hands, right into the heart of her. "You're going to the Starlight Gala," he stated, not a question. She nodded. "And you?" A shadow of a smile touched his lips. "I was trying to avoid it. I'm not one for this." He gestured vaguely towards the opulent entrance of the plaza. "But I have an obligation to my nephew, Charles. He insists my presence lends some gravitas." He said the word with a wry self-deprecation that she found instantly charming. "I understand," she said, and she truly did. "I'm not one for this either." "Then why are you here, Alina?" he asked, his gaze direct, cutting through the pretense. The question hung in the air between them. She could have lied, could have offered a polite, meaningless excuse. But something about him, his quiet intensity, his lack of judgment, made her want to tell the truth. "I'm here to remind myself that I exist," she said, the words coming out with more force than she intended. He nodded slowly, a flicker of understanding in his grey eyes. A worthy cause. He glanced from her face to the entrance, then back again. No one should have to fight that battle alone. "Would you allow me to escort you?" The offer was so unexpected, so absurd, that she almost laughed. Gabriel Ashford, the billionaire recluse, offering to be her escort. But it wasn't a pitying gesture. It felt like an alliance, a spontaneous, unspoken pact between two people who felt like outsiders on the inside. I don't think you know what you'd be getting yourself into," she said, thinking of Adrian, of Vivian, of the inevitable explosion. "On the contrary," he said, his voice dropping slightly. "I think I have a very good idea, and I can't think of anything I'd rather do tonight than disrupt the predictable narrative." He offered her his arm. "Shall we?" And so she had taken it. Walking into the plaza on the arm of Gabriel Ashford felt like stepping into an alternate reality. The doormen, who had barely glanced at her when she'd passed them moments before, now bowed their heads in deference. The whispers started immediately. Now, descending the staircase, his hand was a warm, steady presence on her back, a silent anchor in the turbulent sea of the gala. He guided her down the final steps and onto the main floor. The crowd parted for them, as if by magic. The hum of conversation returned. But it was different now, charged with a new, electric energy. Every eye was on them. "Your ex-husband, I presume?" Gabriel murmured, his gaze fixed on a point over her shoulder. "The man in the Tom Ford tuxedo who looks like he's just seen a ghost." Alina didn't have to look. She could feel Adrian's stare like a physical touch, hot and angry. "That's him," she confirmed, her voice surprisingly steady. "And the woman who looks like she's about to shatter a champagne flute with her grip?" "His fiancée, Vivienne." "I see," Gabriel said. He guided her towards the bar, his movements unhurried, deliberate. He was creating a space for her, a protective bubble in the middle of the chaos. He ordered her a sparkling water with lime, and himself a whiskey, neat. He didn't try to make small talk. He simply stood with her, his presence a silent declaration of support. People began to approach them. Not the fawning sycophants from Adrian's circle, but a different caliber of guest. A tech mogul, a celebrated artist, a foreign diplomat. They all greeted Gabriel with a mixture of awe and familiarity, and he introduced Alina to each of them simply as "my friend." He didn't explain her, didn't qualify her. He presented her as a person of value in her own right. With each introduction, Alina felt a piece of her old self, the confident, intelligent woman who had been buried under years of Adrian's casual dismissals, begin to re-emerge. She found herself talking about her art, about her love for Italian literature, about her travels. She wasn't just Adrian Vale's ex-wife. She was Alina. She risked a glance across the room. Adrian was still there, rooted to the spot, Vivienne clinging to his arm like a vine. He was trapped, and he knew it. He couldn't approach her without acknowledging Gabriel Ashford, and he couldn't ignore her without looking weak. His carefully controlled world was spinning off its axis. Gabriel followed her gaze. "He underestimated you," he said quietly, his voice for her ears only. "He erased me," she corrected, the words raw with a truth she had never spoken aloud. "Then tonight," Gabriel said, turning to face her fully, his grey eyes serious and kind, "we draw you back." It was in that moment that Alina understood. This wasn't just a random act of kindness. This was a deliberate act of rescue. Gabriel Ashford, for reasons she couldn't possibly fathom, had chosen to be her savior. And as he stood beside her, a quiet, immovable force in the gilded cage of the ballroom, she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Hope. The air in the ballroom was thick with unspoken questions. The arrival of Alina with Gabriel Ashford had sent a shockwave through the meticulously stratified society gathered there, and the aftershocks were still reverberating. Adrian Vale, who had been holding court just moments before, now found himself on the periphery, the gravitational center of the room having shifted dramatically. He watched, his jaw tight, as Gabriel and Alina moved through the crowd, not with the frantic, attention-seeking energy he was used to, but with a quiet, confident grace that was far more powerful. Vivienne was seething beside him. "What is she doing here?" She spat, her voice a venomous whisper. "And who the hell is that with her? He looks old." "That," Adrian said, his voice strained, "is Gabriel Ashford. And he's not old, he's powerful. Powerful enough to buy this hotel and turn it into his private office if he felt like it." Vivienne's eyes widened, her anger momentarily replaced by a flicker of fear and calculation. She understood power, and she could see that the man with Alina possessed it in quantities she couldn't comprehend. This changed the equation. Alina wasn't just a pathetic ex-wife making a scene. She was a threat. You have to do something, Vivian insisted, her grip on his arm becoming painful. Go over there. Put her in her place. And say what? Adrian snapped, his composure finally cracking. Excuse me, Mr. Ashford, one of the most influential men on the planet. But this is my ex-wife you're escorting, and I'd like you to return her to the obscurity I had planned for her. He knew he was trapped. Every instinct screamed at him to reassert his dominance, to remind Alina of her place. But one look at the calm, unreadable expression on Gabriel Ashford's face told him it would be a catastrophic mistake. This was a different league, a different game, and he didn't know the rules. Meanwhile, Alina was starting to feel a dizzying sense of empowerment. The man beside her was a shield, his reputation so immense that it deflected the petty judgments and malicious gossip that would have otherwise been directed at her. People who would have cut her dead a year ago were now smiling at her, eager to be introduced. She saw them for what they were, moths drawn to a brighter flame. "Are you ready?" Gabriel murmured, his voice a low rumble near her ear. "Ready for what?" she asked, her heart beginning to pound again. "To face the dragon in his den," he said, his gaze flicking towards Adrian. "It's inevitable. Better to do it on our terms than his." She took a deep breath, the air tasting of champagne and fear. He was right. Hiding in the corner was a temporary reprieve. The real test was yet to come. She gave him a small, determined nod. "On our terms." With a steadying hand on her back, Gabriel began to walk, not away from Adrian, but directly towards him. It was a slow, deliberate advance, and with each step, the ambient noise of the ballroom seemed to fade, the crowd parting before them. It felt like a scene from a movie, a high-stakes showdown in the heart of enemy territory. Adrian saw them coming, and a primal rage, hot and possessive, surged through him. This was his night, his fiancée, his world, and she was walking into it as if she had every right to be there, with a man who made him feel small. They stopped a few feet away, a polite, civilized distance that felt like a chasm. The four of them stood in a silent tableau, the air crackling with tension. It was Gabriel who spoke first, his voice smooth and devoid of any discernible emotion. "Adrian," he said, a nod of acknowledgement. "It's been a while." Adrian was taken aback. "Gabriel, I didn't know you were coming tonight." He forced his voice to sound casual, but it came out tight and strained. "It was a last-minute decision," Gabriel said, his eyes flicking briefly to Alina before returning to Adrian. "I ran into my friend, Alina, and she convinced me it was an event not to be missed." My friend, Alina. The words were a casual, devastating blow. He hadn't called her Alina Vale. He had claimed her, not as a possession, but as an equal, a friend. He had erased Adrian's ownership of her with two simple words. Adrian's eyes finally met Alina's. He had expected to see pain, or anger, or desperation. Instead, he saw a calm, quiet strength he didn't recognize. The emerald dress, the confident posture, the clear, steady gaze. It was all an accusation. This was the woman he had told himself was weak, the woman he had cast aside. And he had been wrong. Vivian, never one to be ignored, stepped forward, her smile as sharp as broken glass. "Well, what a surprise," she said, her eyes raking over Alina with undisguised contempt. "I didn't realize you were still circulating." The insult was clear. "You're no longer relevant." Before Alina could respond, she felt a wave of dizziness, a familiar companion these last few months. The heat of the room, the stress of the confrontation, it was all becoming too much. She swayed slightly, her hand instinctively going to her stomach in a gesture of protection. It was a small movement, almost imperceptible, but in the charged silence, it was a thunderclap. Adrian saw it. His eyes, which had been filled with rage, suddenly widened in stunned disbelief. His gaze dropped from her face to her hand, resting on the gentle curve of her abdomen, a curve that the silk dress could no longer completely conceal. The math was simple, brutal, and undeniable. 6 months since the divorce. The timing was perfect. The blood drained from his face. The anger, the jealousy, the wounded pride. It all evaporated, replaced by a single, cataclysmic realization. A baby. His baby. Vivian saw the look on his face and followed his gaze. Her perfectly painted lips parted in a silent "oh" of shock, her mind racing. A baby. A permanent, unbreakable link between Adrian and this woman she had worked so hard to supplant. It was a complication she hadn't anticipated, a threat to her carefully laid plans. Her own carefully constructed world began to tilt. Gabriel, who had seen the gesture and understood its implication instantly, moved closer to Alina, his hand a firm, supportive presence on her arm. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. His protective stance was a declaration. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. The unveiling had happened, but it wasn't the one anyone had expected. It wasn't about the dress, or the billionaire, or the social triumph. It was about this secret, this new life that had just been laid bare in the center of the glittering ballroom. Alina looked at Adrian, at the raw shock on his face, the dawning horror in his eyes. For the first time all night, she felt a flicker of pity for him. He had thought he was in control, that he was the master of his universe. But in that single, silent moment, he had lost it all. He had discarded the most precious thing he ever had, and he hadn't even known it. She had come here tonight to remind him that she existed. But she had done so much more. She had shown him a future he could never have, a legacy he had unknowingly thrown away. And as she stood there, flanked by her unlikely savior, her hand resting on the secret they now all shared, she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she had won. Not just the battle of the night, but the war for her own life. The aftermath of the silent revelation was not a loud explosion, but a quiet, seismic shift that rearranged the entire social landscape of the ballroom. The invisible threads of power, influence, and respect that held the room together began to snap and reform, creating a new and unsettling pattern. Adrian Vale, who had been at the center of the web, suddenly found himself dangling from a frayed thread. The moment was broken by Charles Thorne, who, oblivious to the high-stakes drama that had just unfolded, bustled over with a wide, oblivious smile. "Uncle Gabriel, I knew you'd show. And Adrian, my man." He clapped Adrian on the shoulder, a gesture that made Adrian flinch. "You all know each other?" Small world. Gabriel used the interruption to his advantage. "Charles," he said, his voice calm and steady, drawing the attention away from the frozen tableau. "I was just congratulating Adrian on his upcoming ventures." He turned his gaze to Alina. "I think we could all use some fresh air. Would you care for a walk on the terrace?" It was a dismissal, polite and absolute. He was extracting Alina from the situation, signaling that the conversation was over. Alina, grateful for the escape, gave a slight nod. "I'd love that," she said, her voice a little breathless. As Gabriel guided her away, his hand still firmly on her arm, a murmur went through the nearby guests. They had seen Adrian's face, Vivian's shock, Alina's gesture. The pieces were clicking into place, and the gossip was spreading like wildfire, fueled by the intoxicating combination of scandal, pregnancy, and the involvement of the enigmatic Gabriel Ashford. Left in their wake, Adrian and Vivian were an island of stunned silence. The protective bubble of their perceived perfection had burst. "A baby!" Vivian finally hissed, her voice trembling with a rage that was colder and more terrifying than her earlier jealousy. "You told me you were done with her. You told me it was a clean break." I didn't know," Adrian stammered, his mind still reeling. A child, a son or a daughter, a part of him, growing inside the woman he had so callously discarded. The implications were staggering. It wasn't just a social inconvenience, it was a fundamental reordering of his life. "You didn't know?" Vivian's laugh was a sharp, ugly sound. "How could you not know? Were you that checked out, that incompetent?" The insult was designed to wound, and it hit its mark. Adrian's entire identity was built on his competence, his control. "It wasn't supposed to happen," he said, more to himself than to her. "We were careful." But even as he said it, he remembered that one night, a few weeks before he'd left, a night fueled by too much wine and a desperate, unspoken sadness. A final, futile attempt to find the connection they had lost. It had been reckless, a moment of weakness he had immediately regretted and promptly forgotten. Until now, he looked around the room. The faces that had been smiling at him with admiration and envy were now looking at him with something else. Pity, curiosity, and a hint of schadenfreude. He saw business rivals whispering behind their hands, their eyes glinting with opportunity. His carefully constructed image as a man who had everything, who was untouchable, was shattering before his eyes. On the terrace, the cool night air was a balm on Alina's heated skin. The distant sounds of the city were a soothing counterpoint to the frantic beating of her heart. "Are you all right?" Gabriel asked, his voice gentle. He led her to a quiet corner, shielded from the ballroom by a large, potted ficus. "I think so," she said, taking a deep, shuddering breath. "I didn't mean for it to happen like that." The reveal. "Sometimes the most effective statements are the ones we don't plan," he observed, his gaze searching her face. He didn't know. She shook her head, a bitter smile touching her lips. "No. He made it very clear he didn't want a family. It would have complicated his brand, his loss," Gabriel said simply, but with a finality that resonated with truth. He took off his suit jacket and draped it over her shoulders. It was warm and smelled faintly of cedar and whiskey. The gesture was so unexpectedly kind, so protective, that it made her throat tighten. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. "Why are you being so good to me?" Gabriel leaned against the balustrade, looking out at the glittering expanse of Central Park. For a long moment, he was silent. "Let's just say I have a vested interest in seeing men like Adrian Vale get a taste of their own medicine," he said, his voice low and hard. "I've seen what their brand of ambition does to people, to good people. There was a story there, a hint of a past that fueled his actions. It wasn't just a whim. His presence here tonight was personal." "It's more than that, isn't it?" she pressed gently. He turned to look at her, and in his grey eyes she saw a flicker of old pain. "My late wife," he began, his voice softer now. "She was an artist, like you. Brilliant, sensitive. She worked for a man like Adrian, a charismatic bully who took credit for her ideas and slowly chipped away at her confidence until she believed she was worthless." He paused, the memory still raw. "She walked away from her art, from herself. I lost her long before she actually died." The confession hung in the air between them, a moment of profound, shared vulnerability. Alina's heart ached for him, for the woman he had lost. She understood now. He wasn't saving her. He was honoring the memory of his wife. In helping her, He was fighting a battle he had already lost once before. "I'm so sorry, Gabriel," she whispered. He gave a sad, small smile. "Don't be. Be strong. Be the woman she never got the chance to be. Live your life. Create your art. Raise your child. That's the best revenge you can possibly have." Inside, the foundation of Adrian's world continued to crack. A potential investor for the Hudson Yards project, a man he had been courting for months, approached him, his expression cool. "Adrian, quite a night. Look, about our meeting next week. Let's postpone. I think we need to see how a few things settle." He didn't need to say more. The man was backing away. The scandal, the perceived instability, the connection to Gabriel Ashford, it made Adrian a risky bet. Adrian watched him walk away, a cold dread seeping into his bones. He had built his empire on an illusion of invincibility. But the illusion was gone, and all that was left was a man standing in the ruins of his own making, watching his ex-wife, the mother of his unknown child, being comforted by a man who held the power to finish the demolition. The power imbalance had not just been flipped, it had become a landslide, and Adrian was on the wrong side of it. In the days that followed the gala, a strange quiet descended upon Alina's life, a stark contrast to the storm she had unleashed. The expected deluge of calls from gossiping acquaintances and the prying press never came. It was as if a protective, invisible shield had been erected around her. She knew, without having to be told, that it was Gabriel's doing. His silent, formidable influence was at work, ensuring she was left in peace. He called her the next morning. Not a text, but a proper phone call. His voice, calm and steady, was a reassuring presence. "I trust you're recovering from last night's festivities?" he asked, a hint of dry humor in his tone. "I'm not sure festivities is the word I'd use," she replied, a small smile playing on her lips. "But yes, I'm all right. Thank you, Gabriel, for everything." "It was my pleasure," he said. "I have a proposition for you, Alina. I have a small cottage on my estate upstate. It's quiet, private. The light is perfect for painting. I thought you might like to use it for a while, to get away from the city, to work, to breathe." The offer was overwhelming in its generosity. A cottage on a billionaire's estate. It sounded like something out of a fairy tale. I don't know what to say," she stammered. "That's too much." "Nonsense," he said firmly, but kindly. "The place is empty, and frankly, I'd enjoy the company. The grounds are extensive. You wouldn't have to see me at all if you didn't wish to." There was a pause. Think of it as an artist's residency. No strings attached. She knew she should refuse, that it was too great an imposition. But the thought of escaping the city, of being surrounded by nature, of having a safe, quiet place to process everything and prepare for the baby, it was an irresistible siren call. "Okay," she said, her voice soft. "Yes, I'd like that very much." 2 days later, a discreet black car arrived to take her and her few belongings upstate. The estate was a sprawling expanse of rolling hills, ancient trees and manicured gardens nestled in the heart of the Hudson Valley. The main house was a magnificent stone manor, but the car bypassed it, following a winding gravel road to a secluded corner of the property. The cottage was perfect. It was a charming, ivy-covered stone building with a large, north-facing window that flooded the main room with the soft, consistent light that painters dream of. Inside, it was cozy and beautifully furnished, with a large easel already set up near the window. There was a fully stocked kitchen and a bedroom with a view of a serene, private lake. It was a haven. For the first week, she saw no one. She painted with a fervor she hadn't felt in years, the colors on her canvases bold and vibrant. She walked by the lake, took naps in the afternoon sun, and cooked simple, nourishing meals for herself and the tiny life growing inside her. The city, with its noise and its ghosts, felt 1,000,000 miles away. The weariness that had settled in her bones began to dissipate, replaced by a burgeoning sense of peace and strength. Gabriel, true to his word, respected her privacy, but he would leave things for her on the porch of the cottage, a basket of fresh vegetables from his garden, a collection of art books from his library, a rare, fragrant tea he thought she might enjoy. They were small, thoughtful gestures that spoke volumes. He was caring for her, but from a respectful distance. One evening, as she was watching the sunset paint the lake in hues of orange and pink, he appeared, walking slowly down the path from the main house. He wasn't imposing, just present. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said, stopping a polite distance away. "Not at all," she said, gesturing to the other Adirondack chair on her small patio. "Please." He sat down, a comfortable silence settling between them. They watched the last sliver of sun disappear behind the hills. "I heard from my nephew today," he said finally, his voice casual. "It seems Adrian Vale is having some trouble with his Hudson Yards project." Alina's heart gave a small flutter. "Oh, the primary investors are getting cold feet," Gabriel continued, his gaze fixed on the darkening water. "They're concerned about his personal stability. It seems a messy public divorce, a surprise pregnancy, and the general perception that he's made a powerful enemy is not good for business." He said it without a trace of gloating, a simple statement of fact. "Is that enemy you?" she asked quietly. He turned to look at her, his expression unreadable in the twilight. "I haven't made a single phone call, Alina. I haven't had to. Men like Adrian build their empires on a foundation of perception. All I did was show up and crack the facade. The rest is just gravity," she believed him. His power wasn't in overt action, but in his very existence. He was the standard against which men like Adrian were measured and found wanting. "He's called me," she confessed, the words tasting like ash. "Twice. I didn't answer. What do you think he wants?" "I don't know," she said honestly. "To yell at me? To demand a paternity test? To try and—" "What?" "Play happy families. I can't imagine any scenario that isn't about him, about what he needs, what he wants to control." "And what do you want?" Gabriel asked, the question simple but profound. She looked down at her hands, resting on her belly. "I want to have this baby. I want to raise him, or her, in a world that is safe and calm and full of love. I want to paint. I want to build a life that is mine, not an extension of someone else's." Her voice was firm, the uncertainty gone. This time in the cottage had clarified everything. "That sounds like a good plan," he said, his voice warm with approval. They sat in silence again, but it was a silence filled with a deep, unspoken understanding. This was more than a friendship, more than an alliance of convenience. It was a connection forged in shared pain and a mutual desire for a quieter, more authentic way of life. He saw her not as a broken thing to be fixed, but as a strong, resilient woman coming into her own. And she saw him not as a billionaire tycoon, but as a kind, wounded man who was, in his own way, trying to heal. "Gabriel," she said, turning to him. "Your wife. You said she was an artist. Did she have a name?" A soft, sad smile touched his lips. "Her name was Mara Ellington," he said, "and she would have liked you very much." In that moment, under the vast star-dusted sky, Alina felt the last of her old fears fall away. She was no longer a victim of Adrian's story. She was the author of her own. And this quiet, powerful man beside her was not just her savior. He was the first character in her new chapter. The quiet alliance had become a quiet, profound bond. Adrian Vale was a man adrift in the wreckage of his own life. The Hudson Yards deal, the one that was meant to be his coronation, had collapsed. The investors, spooked by the instability surrounding him, had pulled out, citing vague market concerns that were a thinly veiled reference to his spectacular social implosion. His name, once a synonym for Midas-like success, was now whispered in tones of pity and contempt in the boardrooms and country clubs he frequented. Vivienne, his fiery, ambitious fiancée, had become a creature of cold, simmering rage. The dream she had bought into, the life of effortless luxury and social supremacy, was tarnishing before her eyes. The diamond on her finger felt less like a promise and more like a consolation prize for a deal that had gone bad. Their magnificent penthouse, once a symbol of their power, now felt like a gilded cage. The silence between them thick with unspoken accusations. But it wasn't the loss of the deal or Vivienne's fury that haunted Adrian's sleepless nights. It was the image of Alina standing on the staircase in that emerald dress, her hand on her belly. His child, a life he had created and abandoned without a thought. He had tried to rationalize it, to frame it as a problem to be managed. He had his lawyers draft letters, demand paternity tests, offer settlements. But Alina had refused to engage. His calls went to voicemail. His emails were unanswered. His lawyers were met with a polite but impenetrable wall of silence from a legal team he soon discovered was being paid for by Gabriel Ashford. The lack of control was driving him mad. He, Adrian Vale, who had orchestrated every aspect of his life with ruthless precision, was now utterly powerless. He was shut out, ignored, rendered irrelevant in the most important event of his life. Desperation clawed at him, a raw, unfamiliar emotion. He had to see her. He had to talk to her, to understand, he didn't even know what. Reclaim something? Apologize? The motives were a tangled mess in his head, a toxic cocktail of ego, regret, and a strange nascent flicker of paternal instinct. He found out where she was from a disgruntled former gardener at the Ashford estate, a man who was happy to trade information for a thick envelope of cash. The knowledge that she was living under Gabriel's protection in a cottage on his land was another dagger to his already wounded pride. He drove upstate on a grey, drizzly afternoon, the weather a perfect match for his mood. He didn't have a plan. He was operating on pure, unadulterated impulse, a way of being he had long ago disdained in others. He bypassed the main gate, parking his car on a side road and cutting through the woods, feeling like a common trespasser. He found the cottage easily, a plume of smoke curling from its chimney. It looked like a postcard, a picture of domestic tranquility that felt like a personal affront. He saw her through the large window. She was standing at an easel, her back to him, completely absorbed in her work. She was wearing a simple, paint-smeared smock, her hair tied up loosely. Her belly was a prominent, perfect curve under the fabric. She was beautiful, more beautiful than he had ever seen her. There was a peace about her, a self-contained serenity that he had stripped from her, and that she had somehow found again, without him. He watched her for a long time, a storm of conflicting emotions raging within him. He saw the woman he had married, the quiet, gentle soul he had once loved before his ambition had poisoned everything. He saw the woman he had broken, and the woman who had risen from the ashes. And he saw the mother of his child. Finally, he stepped out of the woods and onto the path. The crunch of his shoes on the gravel made her turn. Her eyes widened. not with fear, but with a weary, profound disappointment. She wasn't surprised to see him. She seemed to have been expecting this final, desperate act. She didn't invite him in. She simply came out onto the porch, pulling her smock tighter around her, a protective gesture. "Adrian," she said, her voice flat. "You shouldn't be here." "I had to see you, Alina," he said, his voice hoarse. "We need to talk." "There's nothing to talk about," she said, her calmness more unnerving than any anger would have been. "You made your choices. I'm making mine. Our child is not a choice you get to make alone," he burst out, the words raw and possessive. "That's my baby, too." A sad, knowing smile touched her lips. "Is it? You didn't want a baby, Adrian. You wanted a dynasty. You wanted a legacy. But a legacy isn't a building with your name on it. It's a person. And you didn't want a person. You wanted an idea." Her words were like razors, stripping away his self-delusions, laying his pathetic motives bare. "I made a mistake," he whispered, the admission costing him everything. "A terrible mistake." "Yes, you did," she agreed, her voice still quiet, but now with a core of steel. "You made a mistake when you decided that my love was a liability. You made a mistake when you thought you could discard me like a piece of old furniture. And you made a mistake when you thought your money could fix everything." She took a step closer, and for the first time, he saw not just strength in her eyes, but a deep, unbridgeable chasm of pity. "You don't get to do this, Adrian. You don't get to wreck my life and then show up when you're lonely and demand to be a part of the one good thing that came out of the wreckage. This baby deserves better than that. This baby deserves a father, not a landlord." Every word was a nail in the coffin of his old self. He had come here for a reckoning, and he was getting one. But it wasn't the one he'd envisioned. He had thought he would be the one making demands, setting terms. Instead, he was the one being judged, and he was being found wanting. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Money? A contract? Name it." "I want you to leave," she said simply. "I want you to go back to your life, to Vivian, to your glass penthouse, and I want you to leave us alone. That is all I have ever wanted." It was then that another figure appeared, walking down the path from the main house. Gabriel Ashford. He wasn't hurrying. He wasn't angry. He simply walked up and stood beside Alina, a silent, immovable presence. He placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture of quiet, solid support. He looked at Adrian, his grey eyes holding no malice, only a final, profound dismissal. Adrian looked from Alina's resolute face to Gabriel's protective stance. He saw their quiet alliance, the deep, unspoken bond between them. He saw the life they were building here, a life of peace and art and genuine affection, a life that had no room for him. He had lost. He had lost it all. The deal, the respect, the woman he had never truly appreciated, and the child he would never get to know. The realization was a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs, bringing him to his knees on the damp gravel path. This was his reckoning. Not a fight, not a negotiation, but a quiet, devastating moment of clarity. He was the ghost now, the irrelevant figure from a past that had moved on without him. He looked up at the woman he had wronged, the mother of his child, and in her eyes he saw not hatred, but a final, heart-breaking release. She was finally free of him, and he was utterly, irrevocably alone. 6 months later, the first snow of the season was falling, blanketing the Hudson Valley in a layer of pristine white. From the large window of her cottage, now officially her home, Alina Vesper watched the fat, lazy flakes drift down, her newborn son, Elias, sleeping soundly in her arms. He was perfect. He had her quiet nature, and, she had to admit, a shock of dark hair that was pure Adrian. But looking at him, she felt no bitterness, only a profound, overwhelming love. The cottage had become her world, a sanctuary of creation and new life. The walls were covered with her canvases, vibrant, emotional landscapes that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. A gallery in Soho, owned by a friend of Gabriel's, had seen her work and offered her a solo show, her first. The artist's residency had become a career. Her relationship with Gabriel had blossomed in the quiet, unhurried way of things that are meant to last. It was not a fiery, passionate affair, but a deep, steady companionship built on mutual respect, shared vulnerabilities, and a love for the quiet moments. He was a constant, gentle presence in her and Elias's life. He would read the financial news aloud to the baby, claiming it was important to understand markets early, a joke that never failed to make Alina laugh. He would sit for hours in her studio, watching her paint, content just to be in her presence. He was not trying to replace Elias's father. He was simply being the man he was. A kind, decent man who had stepped in to fill a void. They were a family, not a conventional one, but a real one, forged in the crucible of betrayal and rebuilt on a foundation of trust. One afternoon, a package arrived. It was a large, flat box with no return address, only a New York City postmark. Inside, wrapped in plain brown paper, was a painting. It was a small, exquisite piece by a 19th-century artist she admired, a painter known for his serene, light-filled landscapes. Tucked into the corner of the frame was a small, handwritten note. "Alina, there are no words to undo what I did. I know that. There is no excuse for my blindness, my cruelty. I have spent the last 6 months understanding the true meaning of the word bankrupt, and it has nothing to do with money. I saw the announcement of your show. Congratulations. I am not surprised. I always knew you were brilliant. I was just too arrogant to admit it. This is not a gift to buy forgiveness. I know that is not for sale. Think of it as a small, inadequate apology. A down payment on a debt I can never repay. I will not bother you again. I have signed all the necessary papers. My lawyers will be in touch with yours to arrange for child support, to be placed in a trust that you alone will control. He should have everything. He deserves it. I hope he has your heart. It was always the best part of you." Adrian, Alina read the note twice, her hand trembling slightly. It was the first time she had heard from him since that day on the gravel path. The words were simple, stripped of his usual bluster and arrogance. They sounded genuine. She looked at the painting, a scene of a quiet, sun-dappled forest. It was a peace offering, an admission of everything he had lost. She showed the note to Gabriel that evening as they sat by the fire, Elias gurgling softly in his bassinet. He read it, his expression thoughtful. "It seems the man is capable of learning," he said quietly. "What do I do?" she asked. "You do whatever feels right to you," he said, taking her hand. His journey is his own now. It no longer has to intersect with yours unless you want it to. She thought about it for a long time. The old Alina would have been consumed by the gesture, by the lingering connection. But she was not the old Alina. She walked over to the bassinet and looked down at her son. Her future was here, in this room. It was in the smell of baby powder and turpentine, in the warmth of Gabriel's hand, in the steady, rhythmic sound of her own heart. She would not write back. She would not reject the gift. She would simply accept it for what it was. the final, closing chapter of a book she was no longer reading. She would hang the painting in Elias's room, a quiet reminder that even out of great pain, something beautiful could grow. A few weeks later, on the opening night of her gallery show, the room was packed. Her paintings, her vibrant, emotional landscapes, were a stunning success. Critics were murmuring, collectors were buying. Alina stood in the center of it all, Elias strapped to her chest in a carrier, Gabriel by her side, his pride in her radiating like a physical warmth. Across the room, near the exit, a man stood in the shadows, half hidden by a pillar. It was Adrian. He looked thinner, his expensive suit hanging slightly loose on his frame. He wasn't with Vivienne. The gossip columns had reported their amicable split weeks ago. He was alone. He was not looking at the paintings. He was looking at Alina, at Elias, at Gabriel. He was watching the life he had thrown away. Their eyes met for a brief, fleeting second across the crowded room. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement, of concession. Then he turned and slipped out into the cold night, a ghost finally accepting his place in the past. Alina felt a sense of release, a final severing of the cord. She turned to Gabriel, a bright, genuine smile illuminating her face. "I think I'm ready for a glass of champagne," she said. He smiled back, his grey eyes full of a love that was as quiet and as deep as the valley they called home. "I think you've earned it," he said. As he handed her a glass, she looked around the room at her art, at the life she had built. She had faced betrayal and had found strength. She had endured a power imbalance and had discovered her own. She had found redemption, not in revenge, but in creation. She had found a different kind of wealth, one that couldn't be measured in stock portfolios or square footage, but in love, in peace, and in the brilliant, limitless colors of her own canvas. And it was more than she had ever dreamed of. And there you have it, Alina Vesper's incredible journey from a heartbroken ex-wife to a powerful woman who reclaimed her life on her own terms. It's a story that proves that the best revenge isn't loud and flashy, but is found in quiet strength, unexpected alliances, and the courage to build a new future from the ashes of the past. If Alina's story of resilience, redemption, and finding love in the most unexpected place touched your heart, please don't keep it to yourself. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs a reminder of their own strength, and be sure to subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories that feel like real life. Your support means the world and helps us bring more content like this to you. Thank you for watching.